There's a truth anyone who has ever lived in the North can feel. But only the Vikings ever turned it into the soul of an entire age. Fire wasn't just warmth. It was the thin border between survival and the darkness waiting to swallow the world. Archaeological traces scattered from the Alps all the way to the Lofoten coast all tell the same story. That in lands where a single night of shifting winds could wipe out an entire group, flame was never accidental. When Ötzi, the Iceman buried for over 5 millennia, was found, researchers discovered in his tiny travel kit a birch bark tube still holding deep red embers. That detail doesn't just tell us about him, it tells us about humanity itself. Fire had to travel with people because fire was the final heartbeat pushing back death. In Hedeby, Ribe, or Borg, where longhouses stretched as far as 83 meters, wrapped in the smell of smoke and ash, the thick layers of soot beneath the floors showed that the central hearth had never gone out. It was the proof of the leader's authority, the sign that the community was still breathing, that every decision was made under that trembling light. And once you understand why they protected fire at all costs, you'll also understand why every Viking story begins with a single spark. If you want to keep following this journey into the secrets archaeology took centuries to uncover, leave a sign below so I know you're still with me. On journeys through dark forests or across seas so cold they could numb the bones, Vikings knew the greatest danger didn't come from an enemy's spear or a predator's claws, but from the moment they lost the last ember glowing in the palm of their hand. Starting a fire was hard enough, but keeping it alive through rain, wind, and days of relentless travel was the real test. One even the most seasoned warriors feared. No one would ever gamble the life of an entire group on a single strike of flint in the middle of a sudden storm. So, they carried fire the way they carried the soul of their home. That method existed long before their time. Proof lies at over 3,000 meters in the Alps, wherein the belongings of Ötzi, the man who died more than 5,000 years ago, archaeologists found embers wrapped in birch bark, alongside pieces of Fomes fomentarius, a tinder fungus capable of holding a slow-burning fire for hours. This technique, so durable it outlived countless cultures, was inherited and perfected by the Scandinavians. In pre-Viking sites, researchers still find half-burnt fungus and traces of transported embers. To them, fire was never something left behind. It traveled with the people, quiet, fragile, but persistent, like a reminder that no matter how far they went, they always carried a piece of home in the palm of their hand. Not many people today truly understand the desperation of trying to start a fire in a northern storm, where the wind doesn't just blow, but slashes across the ground like icy knives, where soaked clothes cling to the skin like a thin layer of frozen glass, and everything, from your breath to every piece of wood, seems to turn against you. For Vikings, that moment wasn't a challenge. It was a life or death verdict. They knew that failing even once, just once, meant no hot food, no way to dry their clothes, no way to save the children shivering uncontrollably in the darkness. And because of that, they used their own bodies as shields, forming a circle around a flame so small, it felt as if even looking at it wrong could kill it. Damp embers, birch bark scraps with just a little oil left, tiny slivers of dry wood hidden deep inside their clothing. All of it had to work together with a kind of insane patience. Modern archaeological experiments show that with wet wood, even an expert needs 10 to 15 minutes, just to get a flame standing on its own. But what almost no one knows, and this is the terrifying twist, is that a single unexpected gust at the wrong first moment can snuff that flame out faster than it was born, leaving the entire group standing silently in the rain like people who have just lost their last chance at survival. That's why they used stones, cloaks, their own bodies to block the wind, and even tar, the resin they treated like ancient kerosene, to give the fragile flame a longer life. And every time they succeeded, it wasn't just a technical victory. It was a victory over death itself. If you've ever been in a similar situation or have another perspective on this kind of harshness, share it in the comments below. Your experience might open up a whole new angle to this story. In the coastal regions where the northern wind doesn't just howl, but rips across the ground like an animal cornered to its last breath, starting a fire was never a technical skill. It was a desperate negotiation with nature, one where a single misplaced breath could cost the entire group the last warmth still clinging to their bodies. Rain fell in heavy sheets, so cold it seeped through cloaks like fingers clawing into the skin. The hands striking the fire steel trembled not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that even the slightest slip of that spark could turn them into curled-up corpses in the darkness long before dawn had a chance to rise. That's why warriors were often called, not to wield swords, but to become living shields, standing in a circle, using their backs and shoulders to block every gust of wind, because they knew that before a flame is born, it is more fragile than any living creature on earth. At the center of that human ring, a piece of wet birch bark, a pinch of tinder fungus, a smear of tar on a wooden splinter, became their final hope. Modern experiments prove that just one misdirected gust in those first few seconds can snuff the fire out completely, leaving the group standing in the rain like people who've just dropped their only chance of survival. And so, when the flame finally caught, tiny, barely bright enough to light a palm, everyone understood. They had just won a battle no one but them would ever witness. Inside the dim interior of a Viking longhouse, where smoke-blackened pillars stood like silent witnesses of time, fire was never just a source of heat. It was the center of authority, the invisible throne every gaze quietly acknowledged. Seating around the fire wasn't decided by convenience or chance, but by status, loyalty, and the unspoken negotiations only those who understood the house's unwritten laws dared to enter. The one seated closest to the flames wasn't just warmer. They had their face illuminated, a privilege that allowed them to speak less, yet be seen more, a reminder to everyone of just how close they sat to power. While those pushed to the smoky edges, where the heat barely reached and the air stung the eyes, understood that whatever they said would drift away as lightly as ash in the wind. In places like Borg, Hedeby, or Hofstadr, archaeological digs show that even the architecture itself was designed to honor that hierarchy. The closer to the fire, the wider the seating. The farther away, the more the floor was worn down by the footsteps of slaves and servants. Sitting in the wrong place meant insulting the host, even challenging the order of the house. And in a world where honor cut sharper than any sword, one misplaced step could spark conflict. That's why, in a longhouse, warmth didn't just keep people alive. It kept power standing firm. On winter nights that stretched long enough to feel as if they were swallowing all of Scandinavia, when the wind clawed at the walls of the longhouse and darkness crept across the floor like a living thing searching for a way inside, Vikings believed that only fire had the power to open the thin doorway between humanity and the forces hidden beneath the deeper layers of the world. Ritual fire wasn't the same as hearth fire or cooking fire. It was lit with a kind of wary reverence, as if every flicker carried the intent of gods whom farmers, warriors, and chieftains alike dared call only in hushed voices. At Hofstadr, where archaeologists found charred cattle bones beside fragments of broken pottery, many believe those feasts were not simple meals, but moments where humans shared with the gods the parts they could touch, meat and ale, while the rest, the smoke and flame, were sent upward to realms no one could truly see. Fire became the mediator, carrying prayers, promises, and even the community's fears, to a place people could only imagine while staring into the trembling light of a torch. In rituals like these, Vikings felt that the visible world was just a thin shell. Every line of flame crawling across the wood, every tiny crackle inside the embers could be a sign from something listening. And sometimes, when the fire suddenly flared, people believed the gods had responded, not with words, but with light. If you've ever witnessed a fire ritual in any culture, or have your own view on the connection between flame and the unseen world, share it below. Your story might illuminate yet another corner of this mysterious Viking age. When a Viking left the world of the living, the funeral night was never a quiet farewell. It was a moment when the whole community stood on the fragile boundary between the seen and the unseen, where fire became the only path guiding a soul to the other shore. In narrow fjords or on wind-scoured beaches, the wooden boat was pushed out as if it were still waiting for one final voyage. Then, with a single spark, a single torch touching the resin and animal fat, the fire began crawling along the hull like a starving creature, searching its way forward. The crack of wood heated to nearly 900 degrees, the snapping of bones breaking under the heat, mixing with cries stretched thin by the wind until they sounded almost like the mourning voice of the sea itself. All of it created a sight that even Vikings, familiar with death, could not stare at for too long. They believed that within the spiraling columns of smoke rising into the dark, the spirit of the departed was pulling away from the body and ascending toward the gods, and that the higher the smoke climbed and the brighter the flames burned, the clearer the sign that the soul had been received. Evidence from Verka, Gotland, and coastal burial sites shows this wasn't just ritual, but a profound conviction that fire could dissolve the final boundary of human life. If you have a perspective on the power of fire in ancient belief systems, share it below. Your thoughts might reveal yet another layer of meaning behind this ritual. When they set foot in Iceland or Greenland, Vikings quickly realized something that later generations would only fully understand much, much later. In lands where the cold wind could erode both stone and human skin, wood was not something you could rely on. And in that moment, they were forced to look at things no one ever associated with fire to find their chance at survival. The most surprising part wasn't their fire-starting technique, but their choice of fuel. Animal bones burned until they turned white, the remaining marrow and fat creating a brief light just long enough to ignite small bundles of dry grass. Livestock dung dried in the freezing wind and then smoldering for hours, giving off a heat. They hated the smell of but still called life-saving warmth. And tar, pine resin produced in massive earth kilns in Sweden, used like a miracle fuel that could catch fire even with rain slashing straight into their faces. Steatite lamps, burning whale oil in Greenland, their light, small but steady, became companions through nights that felt endless. All of these things, materials no one would ever think of when talking about fire, became the clearest proof of Viking resilience. In utter darkness, anything that could burn became life itself. In lands where winter didn't just linger, but seemed intent on crushing even the smallest human hope, Vikings quickly learned that survival didn't depend on the strength of a sword or the wealth of a family, but on the ability to turn things everyone else would consider worthless into the final source of heat that kept an entire community alive through the night. The most shocking part for modern people is what they chose to burn: animal bones, and in desperate situations, even human bones, thrown into the fire to draw out the last traces of fat, their faint, wavering light just strong enough to dry a scrap of wool or warm a pair of hands shaking from the cold. In Icelandic valleys, livestock dung dried in the wind and then burned slowly for hours became the lifesaver of countless generations, even though its smell was so bad that the animals themselves wanted to stay away. Peat, the thick black earth many would dismiss as useless, burned steadily and saved thousands during winters so long and woodless that children grew up already familiar with its smoky scent. The greatest paradox was this: the poorer they were, the more inventive they became. The more nature pushed them to the edge, the more they found ways to resurrect life from dust and ashes. And it was precisely these seemingly brutal choices that forged a level of survival, strength few cultures in history could ever match. If you know of any crazy fuel or heating methods from history or real life, share them in the comments. Your story might be even more shocking than the Viking era itself. There's something many people only realize after they've walked through the sites, sifted through the layers of ash, and stared at the tiny traces left behind. Most of what we know about the Vikings is told by the very sparks they left for us. And sometimes that truth is more shocking than any legend. The deeper archaeologists dig, the clearer it becomes that fire didn't just keep Vikings alive. It was an ancient form of technology on a scale far beyond what anyone imagined. Ash mixed with dung in Icelandic floors shows they created stable burning systems that lasted for months. The massive tar kilns in Sweden, once thought to be isolated, are now understood to have produced hundreds of liters in a single burn, a scale almost industrial for the 10th century. And in Vinland, charcoal dated by the solar storm of 993 revealed an unbelievable fact. The Vikings carried fire across the ocean nearly 500 years before Columbus set sail. These discoveries offer us a lesson we can't afford to overlook. Ancient people were never primitive or backward. They were simply forced to be smarter than we are in conditions far harsher than anything we know. Their fire wasn't a remnant of the past. It was a reminder that some forms of knowledge only appear when life is pushed to its limits. If you believe there's another ancient technology worth uncovering, leave a comment. And if you want to stay with me on this long journey to decode the secrets buried under 1,000 layers of earth, don't hesitate to subscribe, because we've only touched the brightest part of this story.